Africa is changing. Has it ever occurred to you that how did the richest continent on earth in terms of natural resources become the poorest in terms of living standards? Have you ever heard of phrases like Western imperialism, neocolonialism manifesting themselves in the present day? Africa is changing rapidly. Africa is experiencing social, economic, and political transformation like never before. This is a continent that has been settled by foreigners for generations, and they can't believe it because the kind of transformation that is being experienced in Africa today is something that they couldn't foresee. They are utilizing an institutional means. Africa is changing rapidly, and Africa is undergoing significant social, economic, and political transformation like unseen before, and they can't believe it. The Europeans did not come to Africa to colonize. They came to exploit. Towards the end of the 18th century, an industrial revolution was unfolding in Europe, and Europe needed raw materials for her industries. This is what informed the initial decision to come to Africa. So when they came to Africa, they came to exploit the natural resources that were present in abundance in Africa. When they came to Africa, they were disorganized. For instance, each European power present at that time was acting independently without coordination on how to approach colonization. They were, for example, some European nations had overlapping territorial claims over Africa. They also had differing approaches. Some, like Britain, seek to establish trade relations with the local leaders, while others like France and Belgium under King Leopold II had more imperialistic goals. But yet, for fear of the scrambling escalating into an all-out European war on the continent of Africa, King Leopold II requested Otto von Bismarck, the then Chancellor of Germany, for the Berlin Conference. And so, on the 15th November 1884, the Berlin Conference was convened in Germany. In attendance were 14 nations, but out of which 7, which were Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and the United States, came home without a formal possession of Africa. By 26 February 1885, they adjourned. The European powers now used various methods and tactics, and by 1914, the entire continent was colonized. Consequent to the many factors that prompted end of colonization, such as the rise of nationalism all across Africa, and the many other factors that led to the end of colonization, the colonial governments, reluctant to grant African nations their independence, they figured out that they needed structures in place that would ensure that the European industries would continue to exploit Africa and basically get their resources as raw materials for their industries. At the dawn of independence, many African nations adopted a socialist, people-centered modes of governing. These governments set out on ambitious development ventures, each striving to elevate the welfare of its people, each striving to elevate their nations to new heights of progress and prosperity. They embarked on purposeful journeys of economic reforms, technological advancements, and social welfare initiatives. Infrastructure projects blossomed across the land. For connecting previously isolated communities. Education and healthcare systems were revitalized and expanded properly. These independent African nations were not devoid of challenges, but they were thriving. This era of socio-economic transformation in across Africa was, however, to be short-lived. 22nd May 1964, delegates from the 32 newly independent African nations are gathered in Addis Ababa. It's a crisis meeting. On the table we have promoting decolonization, establishing a coordinated response to emerging common threats. On this particular issue, the delegates are divided. A faction that had previously met in Casablanca, Morocco, led by Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, Sekou Toure of Guinea, King Idris I of Libya, Modibo Keita of Mali, King Hassan II of Morocco. This group is advocating for a rapid and immediate political union of African states. They envisioned a strong centralized government with a common foreign policy and defense infrastructure. On the other hand, we had the Monrovian group. They preferred a more gradual approach to integration, prioritizing economic cooperation and regional development. There were 25 countries out of the 32 who attended. They outnumbered the Casablanca group. 4 days into the conference on the 25th of May, culminating into the signing of the OAU Charter, this marked the official birth of the Organization of African Unity. To the Casablanca group, it's a compromise. It is not what they were initially advocating for. These African states returned as individual nations, marched to their demise and to the joy of the neocolonialists. You really need to understand this. The European powers needed to continue to exploit Africa's resources. But since European powers had been devastated from the losses incurred during the Second World War, they couldn't continue to sustain their colonies, especially amidst a spike in the struggle for independence across African countries. They achieved this till today through the following 3 approaches. The first approach was to properly disable Africa's ability to add value to those raw materials, so that they will forever take them to the Europeans for processing. They disabled Africa's ability to add value to those products by the use of various techniques. Here's where the SAPs were brought in, the structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment programs were portrayed to be the much needed help that Africa required. But yet in reality, these programs were meant to kill Africa's ability to have industries. African countries were coerced into ratification of phases after phases of structural adjustment programs. These structural adjustment programs were basically unfair trade policies that were imposed on African countries without the option of rejecting them. The SAPs manifested themselves in the form of severe currency devaluation that promoted exports and ensured that African raw materials were cheap to obtain, trade liberalization that exposed domestic industries to competition from cheaper imports and killed African industries, public sector reforms such as cuts in government spending that reduced the capacity for effective governance and acutely reduced access to essential services like healthcare, education, and safety nets. The privatization of state-owned enterprises that meant that government had to relinquish control over strategic sectors like energy, water, and telecommunication. The second approach they used to continue the exploitation of African resources was to maintain significant political influence over Africa by exercise of 3 courses of action. Firstly, they set up and maintained significant military presence all across Africa, with countries like the United States having 29 military facilities in 15 African countries. The second course of action was to forever install their puppet rulers in African states and overthrow governments that resented. The other crucial course of action is where the French Pact for the continuation of colonization comes to play, that had the most outrageous terms.
We're going to demand that you deposit 85% of your bank reserves with the French Minister of Finance. Under the French Central Bank, under the control of the French Minister of Finance. France is then going to take your 85% bank deposits from each and every one of you. Deposit those funds in the French stock market under the French name. And you may or may not know the returns.
Economically, if you were to compare by comparing the Francophone nations with their Anglophone counterparts economically, Anglophone African countries, the GDP per capita for Anglophone African countries is $2,951, while for Francophone nations it's 865. That's like 3 times the GDP per capita. If you look at other economic indicators such as average growth rate for the average growth rate for Anglophone countries, yet still low, 4.2%, while that of Francophone is 3.0%, 0.0%. Trade and investments, you have trade openness, percentage of trade openness of GDP. In Anglophones it's 54.2, in Francophones it's 48.7. Foreign and direct investment percentage of the GDP, in Anglophones is 3.1, in Francophones is 2.4. Human Development Index, both are medium, but we have the Anglophones 0.539 and the Francophones we have 0.55. Literacy rate, the Anglophones we have 66.5, the Francophones we have 61.9. They are lagging behind in everything economically. Ease of doing business, we have the Anglophones again an average ranking of 135 out of 190, while the Francophones rank an average ranking of 142 out of 190, ease of doing business in those countries. So this colonial legacy really took a tougher grip on especially the Francophone nations. The third and final approach that they used to continue the exploitation of Africa was actually preconceived and planned in the Berlin Conference. It's the most clear. They seek to partition Africa into tiny pieces that lacked the mantle to perform economically, and they were also easy to destabilize in the event these African countries were to progress in any way economically that attended their imperialism goals, that they wouldn't exploit these African countries anymore. These African countries were easy to destabilize. It will be wrong for anyone to purport or say that Africans have not tried to liberate themselves from this quagmire. Many Africans before and even now have struggled to liberate themselves. Some have succeeded while most have been thwarted brutally by the West. Take for instance, in 1961, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated in a coup d'etat. orchestrated by the Belgian government supported by the United States. This intervention was motivated by Lumumba's desire for national independence and his anti-colonial rhetoric. In 1966, Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, was overthrown in a military coup. The coup was supported by the CIA due to Kwame's socialist policies and his pan-Africanist stance. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown and killed following a NATO-led military intervention. The intervention was justified as a humanitarian mission to protect civilians from Gaddafi's force, but it was motivated by the desire to access Libya's oil reserves and remove long-standing opponents of Western interests. Till this date, there are over 22 confirmed military coups. It is imperative that Africans understand that the future of Africa is in their hands, and the solution will not come from other foreign countries. The solution has to be from within. To this end, it becomes a right and a duty of the people in pursuit of the common good to assert their sovereignty with personal actions and progress discreetly and publicly. It is about time we get back to the trenches and recover what our freedom fighters so hardly fought for. If we were to look at the ramifications of the structural adjustment programs, we could draw case studies from various countries. The structural adjustment programs killed so many industries in the African continent. They increased the debt of so many African countries to exorbitant levels and turned exporters into importers of goods that were previously manufactured locally. So we could go on and on about the ramifications of the structural adjustment programs. The entire sub-Saharan Africa, if you look at the debt, before in 1980 it was 560 billion. By the time the SAPs were fully implemented, the debt rose to 1,622 billion US dollars. When we talk about puppets, or for that case, Western puppets in the continent, what we mean is African leaders who don't have the interests of their people at heart. They can't even determine their own foreign policy. They are just being told by other foreigners that do this or else, do this or else, turn right, implement this. You want a loan from the IMF? Do this, increase taxes, and taxation kills the probability of doing business, any business in that country. It kills industries. These are what we call the SAPs, the structural adjustment programs. They still manifest till today in the form of loans that we don't know why we are still paying. Some of them are exorbitant at abnormal interest rates. You get to wonder a lot. These are African leaders, and they are the most dangerous. They are worse than the colonizer. Because the colonizer, you could see the white man who everyone was against. But to these Western puppets, they are Africans who speak our language, but they do the same things that the colonizer was doing, and they have our support. People support them, though most in case they are not that popular. But some people support them. Let's share information on policies that are being implemented in Africa that are aimed at killing local entrepreneurship and local enterprising industries. Share information on those. Those are the structural adjustment programs, the unfair trade policies that are being forced on these African countries.